my authentic analysis of systemic racism. Hey, what's up? It's Brian here, and in this video I'm going to go deep into systemic racism and offer my authentic, real perspective on it. And this is my 9th video in the 10-part series on racism that I'm doing also. And look, this video is not for everyone because it's going to be long and I'm going to go into a lot. But if you're someone that really is particular about making the world a better place and just cares about issues that might be affecting people, then this video is for you. So there's a lot of overlooked systemic issues that might be tied to racism, and then also some things that people talk about tied to racism may not be also. And this is a very important video that I'm doing, I believe, because there's so much talk in the United States on systemic racism right now, but there's very little talk on actually defining it and going into solutions to it. So I'm going to go really in depth with it in this video. And even though it's going to be long, I still can't go over everything in this video because there's so much to cover. So I might do like a part 2 video, maybe like a year from now, going further into things. And throughout the video, I'll reference different points like I need to research this more, or I might do another video on this within the next year. So I'll talk like that throughout also. And most things are connected in this video too. So it's really important to watch the whole thing. So I may be talking about something, say 6 minutes in, and then maybe something like 20 minutes in, and they might be highly connected. So keep that in mind too. And I'm mainly talking about the United States in this video, so it's from that lens and systemic racism against Black people. But I'm not saying that's the only type of systemic racism. And if you're watching this from another country, that's all right, because just the logic that I use and how I analyze different things in society, you can apply that to your own country as well. And first, I just want to go into defining it. So, I typed in on Google just to get the definition from online first, and I got institutional racism, also known as systemic racism, is a form of racism that is embedded as normal practice within society or an organization. It can lead to such issues as discrimination in criminal justice, employment, housing, healthcare, political power, and education, among other issues. But honestly, it is pretty much just a made-up term, so like everyone is kind of free to interpret it as they please. So for me, like, I agree somewhat with that definition. I think it can be tied to government law or policy, but it doesn't have to be. It could just be like how specific areas of the world or society function, or people's reaction to those areas, or just maybe commonplace like acceptance of misguided ideas that are out there as well. But in general, like, I wouldn't get too wrapped up in like the semantics of it, and more so in the application of the idea of systemic racism. And I think this is really important because look, like, if someone says like, do I believe in systemic racism? Like, that's such a broad question that it is impossible to answer, because then the question is like, so which system are you talking about? And then from there, like, so which part of that system are you talking about? It's kind of like the question, like, is this person good or is this person bad? It's like, well, which, character trait are you discussing about that person? Like, because everyone has varied levels of character traits, just like different sectors of society have varying levels of fairness and unfairness. So that's something to keep in mind too. So it's a very nuanced conversation, and that's why it's so disheartening, honestly, how vague the conversation is. Just researching like so much articles that I've read and videos really for the past few years on this subject, it just is so vague. Like, it might say something like, so there's this disparity out there, so because of a history of racism, that means there's systemic racism, so then we have to have these conversations. So like, that's how the articles kind of frame things, but then they don't actually talk about like what the conversation actually is. So this video, I'm going to go into what I believe the conversation should be. And I want to say too that I am not proclaiming to be an expert on all these subjects. I'm way more confident in my opinion of the psychology of racism and the issues I'm going to talk about relate to that. And I'm less confident in my perspective on maybe the history of racism or those sort of things. So I definitely have to research more, and I'm going to mention that throughout. Partly because I'm 27 years old, so of course I haven't lived through most of the racist stuff in the past 100 years. So I'm very ignorant to that stuff, and I don't proclaim to be an expert on that. But through this video, I just want to encourage you to research and self-reflect on your own. And every single article and idea that I express in this video, I'm going to link in the description also. So hopefully that's helpful to you watching. So the first thing that I want to really go into is some of the topics you initially hear in regards to systemic racism. So one is the wealth gap in the United States. So I'm going to go into that right now. And a confusion with this, and probably over half of the subjects related to systemic racism, is it's not always clear. Is like, is this a race problem or a poverty problem? Because of course, Black people are disproportionately poor in the United States. So it's not really clear, like, is this people being racist or they just don't like poor people? So that can be a tricky thing to determine. And I'm not going to go into that too much because it's very hard to determine intentions that someone has. But I will go into kind of how it plays out in real life. And one thing kind of tied with this is the main thing people talk about in regards to systemic racism is taxes. So of course, like, more affluent neighborhoods or schools would get more resources than, you know, schools in a district that has a lot of poverty. So I'm going to go into this a little bit more in the education section in a few minutes, but this is just a hot topic, and honestly, I don't have the framework and the knowledge to really tackle this right now, besides the usual, like, every community should have the basic resources and stuff. But I do want to acknowledge that I think a lot of people, when they make it, they move to more affluent areas, they'll be like, well, of course, like, if I'm paying taxes, like, it should go to my school and not someone else's school. And then people who are in poverty, they feel often the opposite. We're like, wait, it should be distributed evenly because that's not fair. So there's a lot of bias in the conversation with people kind of taking the side that they are on. You know, as someone who, I'm closer to being in poverty than in a wealthy area right now. So I don't want to be biased and just be like, distribute the resources evenly because I'm in a poor area right now. My child is going to go to school in a few years. So like, I can easily do that. And I think a lot of people do because it's like what benefits them. But I want to challenge people to look behind the surface with that sort of thing. But again, I don't have the solution specifically to that, but I'm going to go into it more later in the video. But I think with this whole conversation too on systemic racism, inherited wealth is a major topic of concern. And it's tricky because, like, of course, Black people were discriminated against, and, you know, the inherited wealth gap is so huge between white people and Black people and some other races too. Of course, I'm not insinuating those are the only two races, but this is tricky because it's like wealth has to matter to an extent. Because if it doesn't, you're like, so when you die, where's the money going? Like, I think people who advocate for, you know, inherited wealth not to matter, they're pretty much advocating for it to go to the government, which I think is really not moral. You know, I think it should matter because everyone wants their money passed on to generations. That's why people have incentive to save money. You know, that's why, like, I'm saving money now. Even at 27 years old, we only go out to eat probably like once every 2 weeks, or we get takeout every 2 weeks. Precisely because, like, when I'm older, like, I want to have money saved, not just for me, but for Ace, my son, for other children maybe that I'll have, you know, for them to go to college. So, like, if you told me right now, like, when I die, like, everything I got just goes to the government and I'm not rewarded for the sacrifice and the hard work in terms of, like, not spending money right now, like I said, then I probably would be spending more money right now. I would go on more vacations when I'm 60 years old, 70 years old. So it's a very tricky dynamic because you got to reward sacrifice to a certain extent. But of course, the disparities exist because of past racism, partly, especially for those that were directly impacted. So it's tricky to solve. So I think one solution is just prioritize parenting and money management techniques. And I'm gonna go way deeper into family dynamics later on in the video. But specifically in regards to finance, I believe an easy solution is just teach finance, money management, how to budget, build credit, about the banking system, how to invest money, about the stock market, how to analyze prices online, luxuries versus wants. Teach all this in school, because I think so many young people and just people in life, they don't know how to manage their money. You know, they're very naive about the stock market, for example. Like, I'm 27 years old. I mean, I only started investing in the stock market in the past year. You know, like, I'm not saying I was ignorant to it when I was 20, but honestly, I probably was. I mean, if someone told me about it, I'd be like, look, this is pretty easy way to save money. Is better than it just being in a bank account. So just simple things like that. It's like you're not taught. You know, to a certain extent, I understand why you're not, because look, parents, I mean, should be teaching that, but, you know, sometimes you gotta kind of, to even out the playing field, so to speak, teach some things in school to almost make up for maybe bad parents, to be honest, or maybe parents that, you know, don't prioritize like every area of of life pretty much. So that's something to keep in mind. So that would help people regardless of race, but it would help everyone. And a lot of times too, solve systemic issues, it is kind of targeting like everyone, because that would kind of even the playing field, because again, with taxes, more resources usually go to more affluent areas. So that's something to keep in mind. And this is just like, I always look at things from the eyes of a parent too, like how I talk to my child and just how I talk to a young person. So my job, I work with youth out of foster care. Like if my client is overspending on his or her money, like I'm gonna be straight up with them, like you're spending money on shoes too much or a luxury and not wants. So like just these types of conversations, like so many young people have to have. So if we're talking about a wealth gap, the conversation on money management needs to be had. And this goes deeper into it than just saying like, oh, just distribute the wealth evenly, which is shallow. And I think that doesn't really go to the core issue of people maybe not managing their money correctly. And the reason why that is that often throwing money at a person's life doesn't often solve the issues that they're going through. A lot of times people who are broke, at times, not always, they have almost a broke mindset. So they're so used to living paycheck to paycheck that they're always going to be like that until there's a mindset shift. So you want to keep that in mind too. Don't just throw money at the problem, because that doesn't go to the core issue of things. And also, like, side note, like, the meaning of life, I believe, is not tied to money at all. So I'm going to go into that later. But like, your mental health is the most important thing. So always prioritize that over anything. And that should be empowering to you if you're poor out there, to be honest. And one thing with the wealth gap and the conversation on that in regards to systemic racism is also like the network and connections that people have. So I hear sometimes online, like, white people maybe have more connections to jobs or that sort of thing. And I do believe that on average, that probably is true. I would mention though, I think that's really on a case by case basis. And it's also tied to personality also. So someone like myself, I've always kind of saved myself for better or for worse. And I've never ever gotten a job through someone else. I've always just gotten it the old school way, applying online for a job. So, in terms of that, like, that's a case by case basis. But I think one solution to that the government can do is just create better websites. I think like providing resources, like in terms of the job fairs in a local area or a networking event, or maybe like how to create a LinkedIn profile, just all that stuff, like all the knowledge and stuff. I think the government can start to facilitate that a little bit. And again, like, this is like almost outside of what they've done in the past, 50 years, 100 years. But I believe innovation in the government, I think we're at the time and place that needs to happen. So really just sharing knowledge with people out there. And I also saw online in an article, it said, quote a couple of things in regards to the wealth gap. It talks about redlining in the past, subprime loans, foreclosures, and other predatory practices that have hurt Black people. And again, I need to research this a lot more to have an informed opinion on this, but just keep in mind that that's a part of the issue also. And I know JP Morgan put $30 billion into fixing systemic racism over a certain amount of years. And it said in the article that they're pretty much going to extend billions of loans to Black and Latino homeowners and business owners and build affordable housing units and that sort of thing. So like, again, it's kind of vague reading these articles, and I'm not really clear on like, is this really tackling the underlying issues, and then what are the underlying issues actually are. Again, I'm going to go deeper into the underlying issues, I believe, later on in the video. But again, in that article, it said, quote, the study said Black families are disadvantaged by a risk-based pricing system which charges higher mortgage rates for lower down payments and credit scores. So again, like, even in the article, like, it's kind of referencing like credit score and stuff. So it's not saying like Black people are discriminated against solely because of their race, but it is saying like poor people are quote unquote discriminated against because of maybe low credit scores or something like that. So again, race and poverty overlap a lot, so it can be kind of confusing to tackle how to solve. It's like, should we just empower poor people or empower Black people or both? It's kind of confusing. I mean, everyone is an individual. You always have to keep that in mind also. And you can't be in a rush to just do something, because again, this is a very complicated issue. And if you can't also use systemic racism to solve systemic racism and discriminate against other races too. Because then that's just a game that's going to repeat over and over throughout history if that's the case, in my opinion. And you also kind of hear some things where they target areas where Black people are present more. And I've heard the term Black banks also, and I really dislike that term. And the reason why is that it almost insinuates that people are segregated right now. And, I feel like the mainstream media almost wants it like that. And it's very discouraging. So again, like I live in the hood, I live in a majority black area, and I don't even think about that until I read stuff like this. Like, like black banks, like that's just a weird term, honestly. I mean, there's banks in the area right now, and of course they're probably owned by white people, but black people and white people and everyone, they know like how to start a bank account pretty much. So I don't really know what the difference would be if it's owned by a black person or a white person. It's not very clear to me, to be honest. So really like think deeply about stuff you read, because some things just don't really make sense on the surface, and you really got to dig deep. Like, how will this actually change anything at all? And one thing I do want to mention too is that in terms of like the wealth gap and like communities like needing money and stuff like that, people can't be destroying the community as they're talking about systemic racism, because they're just being a hypocrite in that case. So for example, like sometimes people rob different places. Like there was a lot of looting in my area a few months ago, and that's so discouraging to businesses that are trying to come in to uplift people. And again, 90% of people agree with that statement, but there's always like 5% people like, oh, you can't say that. Well, I'm not scared of you because I know you're the small minority, 5% of people that don't make any sense whatsoever. So again, you're concerned about systemic racism. We got to invest in the community. You got to build up the community. So we really got to do that to places in poverty, or people that are just going through challenges. And housing is also tied with this also. Again, I need to research this stuff more because there's so much here. This video could be 10 hours long if I had 10 hours and 10 days of time to just really go deep into things. But one thing like with this is, with housing, I want you to keep in mind is that don't confuse individual racism with systemic racism. So sometimes I hear like a realtor maybe gives someone a bad price when they're selling a home, or maybe they, raise the price if someone is black or something. Like that's terrible. But that is individual racism, and I wouldn't get that confused with systemic racism. But again, if there is a habit of doing that in the system, then you can define it as that. But it's not too clear in that scenario. So the wealth disparity, I find, is talked about very shallowly in the United States. So we have to fight against that, I believe. I hope the couple of solutions and mindsets I provided are helpful to you. But again, do your own research. I'm going to research some more too, because there's a lot more to it. And another major topic that people talk about in regards to systemic racism is education. So I'm going to go over a few things that I see people talk about and then offer my viewpoint on them. So one is equitable funding, which again is tied to what I talked about before, where poor districts get less funding than more affluent areas. But I will say that as someone who has worked in schools, and I am knowledgeable to a certain extent on this, I feel like this is improving over the last few years. And areas, no matter if it's a poor area or a rich area, have access to different technologies and that sort of thing. But I do think this can improve in general. And another thing that I see too is that online it mentioned that there is disproportionately policing in schools that have black children than white children or other races. So with this too, I will say that I think this problem is more so some outsider coming in and thinking it is an issue when it's not really that big of an issue. So what I mean by that is I worked in a middle school about 5 years ago in the inner city, Grover Washington Junior Middle School, and there was a police officer in the school, and honestly, like all the students respected him and thought he was cool, and the teachers, thought that he was a valuable staff member too. It wasn't a situation where he was like this big authority figure and he like just instilled the consequence. Like, he was pretty chill. So I think a lot of times police officers in schools are that sort of police officer and not like, the racist police officer you see on the news. So keep that in mind also. I do think the conversation on the role of a police officer can be had in terms of like, you don't just want to deliver consequences to a student, but your role should really be multifaceted, where you're really like interacting with the students, trying to facilitate their self-development and that sort of thing. But again, I think stuff like that is already going on. And another thing that I mentioned, or that I saw in the article, is on punishment too. It said black children are disproportionately punished in terms of suspensions and that sort of thing than white children. But reading this, I was thinking like, is punishment a bad thing now? Like, I was not aware that punishing someone is like an inherently bad thing. And I think it is ridiculously patronizing to have maybe lower consequences to a race, or insinuate that their self-improvement and them taking responsibility for their actions doesn't matter. So I think this also ties into the idea that just because there is inequity does not mean that there's unfairness. And because then like you need to realize that this is a very slippery slope, because then it's like if punishment needs to be equal, then the next step is, should grades be equal also? Because like in a classroom, say of 25 students, if there's 5 people of every race in the classroom, of course you're not going to have the same grades for every single student and just have the equity amongst races in the classroom. So if that is true, then of course in school to school there's going to be a disparity also. So that's something to keep in mind too. And it's like, if my child is also one of the most highest performing students in the class, I don't want misbehaving children to be taken away from his learning. And I would hope their parents would think the same thing. Like I always look at things from a parent's lens. So like if my child is 12 years old and he's acting up in school and maybe does something like really wrong or fight someone or something like that, like please give him the consequence that he deserves. Like he needs to take responsibility for his actions. And again, don't treat him like a child. Like he can take responsibility for his actions. So I think the conversation on punishment is a little bit confusing as I'm reading it, because it's not inherently a bad thing in my opinion. And I would say in regards to punishment though, the form of punishment does matter. So I worked at a great school in Philadelphia, in an alternative high school for 18 to 21 year olds who dropped out of school. It was called Youthville Philadelphia Charter School. They had a great culture around restorative discipline, like really going to the root of the issues that students were having, or disagreements, or just like bad behavior pretty much. And students really respected the teachers and the staff members because of that. And again, it was a very loving environment. I mean, we really cared for the students, and that came across. So like if you're punishing students from that lens, like that's all right. But the form does matter. I think restorative discipline in schools can be to a greater extent overall. And one thing mentioned in the article I read was equitable access to advanced coursework. And honestly, I didn't know this was an issue, to be honest, to the extent that it was mentioned in the article. But if everything that was said is true, that seems like an issue that we got tackled. I will say that it seems like this has been improving. But yeah, of course, like in a poorer area, they gotta have access to the best resources in terms of like the courses and that sort of thing. And I think this may play into implicit bias also, which is mentioned in the same article too. And it's the implicit bias in the form of bigotry of low expectations, I believe. So maybe having lower standards for a black child. Like for my mixed race child, right? I don't want him growing up and then people viewing him like inferior because of his race, or not holding him to the standard of other races or other children out there. So like higher discipline also, I believe, is tied to less implicit bias. So like this is kind of ironic, because like this is in opposition to the idea that punishment is bad, because often implicit bias tends to people not disciplining black children because they have lower expectations for them. So keep that in mind. Like tough love is very necessary in the inner city and in every school, I believe. And a thing mentioned too is to diversify the curriculum. And again, stuff like this is already going on, but of course it can be to a greater extent. And it's cliche a little bit to like talk about, oh, you need to talk about the context of slavery and stuff like that. But I would be very specific and like, do not just talk about the struggles of black history, of black people, but really talk about black excellence and like, different victors in the black community and in all races. Because I think sometimes in history classes it can be too much like, oh, white people were superior in the past, they did all this, and black people were the victims and they were always slaves, and like all this bad stuff happened to them. So like from the concept of systemic racism, as I'll go into later on in the video, that's like teaching a black child like, this is all the bad stuff that happened to your race, you're disadvantaged, and to the white child you're teaching them, this is all the good stuff that happened to your race, you're superior. So you really want to push back against that sort of thinking in schools. And that's why I personally push back against critical race theory, because that ties in a lot of those ideas in terms of disempowering black children and then teaching white children either that they're superior because of their race or they should feel shame because of their past. So it kind of is negative on both sides. So one thing that I want to mention now is that some of the articles I read were just tough to read. So I'm going to go into kind of some things you see and why you should disregard them, because it takes away from the actual meaningful conversations in regards to systemic racism. So a couple of things in the article, like one was just a leap, and it said, quote, black people are also discriminated against because of their hair and may have fewer opportunities to enter and complete higher education. So there was nothing at all cited for this. And honestly, I don't know what city this person lives in or place, I don't really see the connection at all with that, and I really do not think that is true. So you gotta watch out for that. Just disregard random sentences like that in certain articles. And a few of the articles, they didn't even mention like the study specifics. It is very tough because like in a lot of these articles, they might mention like all these claims and then link to an article that supposedly talks about the claim. But then sometimes when you click the article that's linked from the article, then it links to another article, which then links to the actual study. So like you gotta really go through a lot of hoops just to kind of determine like, is this true or not? And then at times I've noticed like I've followed the link like 2 or 3 times and then it went to the article and like it wasn't actually the conclusion from the article or the study was not actually what the article was saying. So it's kind of like the whisper down the lane sort of thing. It's like you transferred over several articles, like there's going to be some distorted information there. So you got to watch out for that. And yeah, that's just my biggest pet peeve. Like one time I did this, like I followed the article and it went to a study from literally 2003, like 17 years ago. And this was in regards to like when people are hired for jobs, like if it's a black sounding name, that people are hired less than a white sounding name. And honestly, like just from my experience in life in general, like I do not think this is true. And even in this study, it talks about like 2 resumes were compared and like, you know, sent to all these employers. But like even in the study, it doesn't actually show what the resumes were amongst the 2 people. So it's like, it's not very clear. Like if you're gonna talk about the issues, you gotta control for all the other variables. And why would you hide what the actual resumes were? That's not very clear to me. So you really have to watch out for some articles just being biased and kind of manipulating information to prove a point that they want to make. And a lot of these articles too, I think it's just so disempowering to black children and black people. So I think that in and of itself is a form of systemic racism in terms of people just making up all these things that are supposedly holding black people back. Some things are true, some things I think are way overblown. And I think that's just so disempowering to black people, and it's brainwashing black children, I believe, to just not be responsible for their success in life. And that's something I'm actively gonna fight against for my child. It's really reducing the drive of black youth out there when you tell them like they're not gonna get a job because they have a black sounding name. Like that is just ridiculous, honestly, in my opinion. And you know, education is just so important too. And I think you need to be very careful. Like, don't just throw money at the issue. Like, just funding a school does not solve things because mental health is not a money thing. You know, I think to a certain extent, like if you hire better teachers, maybe you put more teachers or aides in a classroom, like that's tied to money and that could help. But you gotta be very specific, like where the money's going. And mental health, I think, is the number one thing that has affected black people over the years and is the direct legacy of slavery potentially. Because it's like this, when you're talking about the averages of something, like the averages in terms of grades or the averages in terms of, you know, how much money someone makes or something, that is connected to past history. Meaning like in systemic racism, you can argue it's just past racism, but you can argue that's still systemic. So it's like if your, say, great-great-great-grandmom was a slave and didn't know how to read, it's like, well, her children maybe weren't the best readers because their parents didn't know how to read. And then their children weren't the best readers because their parents didn't know how to read. It's like, you can kind of tie that to a lot of different life skills just because of slavery in the past. So I think when you're talking about the averages, that plays into it a lot and contributes to a lot of the inequity. So I think that conversation needs to be had also. And this is why, like, uplifting education, I think, though, that's a really important conversation because it uplifts everyone. You know, it's not a finite resource. You know, like sometimes just throwing money at someone, say when they're like 25 years old, that's like, you only have so much money to go around. But improving schools, like teaching someone something, that's free in terms of like the words coming out of someone's mouth. So I think that's a great investment, like really tackling education. And there's a lot more to go into it. I'll probably do a future video on education reform in maybe like 8 months or so. But there's just so much thing tied to that, and you really have to research things and don't have like, I'm trying to save the school mentality sort of thing and just like you're the outside, like you know everything. Like no, it's a very complex issue and you need to really learn from what great schools are already doing because there's a lot of great schools out there. And I think schools in general, like they can teach way more diverse classes like life skills and just different things that students maybe need to know. And I think parent collaboration in schools is needed so much more. Like, I worked in a middle school. I remember the back to school night probably had like 4 or 5 of the kids' parents out of like a 30 student classroom, and that was consistent amongst all the classes in that grade too. So I think that's just insane to me. So I think parent collaboration is really needed. Like, parents and teachers really have to collaborate, be on the same page. Like, what is being taught in school? How can we teach our children the best way that we possibly can? Hire the most open-minded, best teachers that we possibly can hire. And you also have to keep in mind too is that a lot of the conversations about systemic racism in education treat the leaf of the issue anyway, and it targets education later in life. But this is so important. This is a major thing that I'm going to say right now, is that a lot of the disparities amongst races are already there in elementary school. So when you're talking about inequity later on in life, you got to go to the core of the issue, the root of it, and you can't tackle it after it's already there, because you're not treating anything to that degree. You're just kind of putting a band-aid on certain issues. So this is really important to understand. And I'm going to mention these studies, like I said, down in the description, but a few of them that I'll mention is that the average reading score for 4th graders, there's a disparity between white 4th graders and black 4th graders. So it said that the gap is 26 points in 2017, which has actually gotten 6 points less since 1992. There's also a study for 4-year-olds where they judged the proficiency in recognizing numbers and shapes, and there was also one in terms of cognitive ability too. And there was a disparity there amongst races. So the proficiency, it said Hispanic children 51%, black children 55%, children of 2 or more races 65%, white children 73%, Asian 81%. So like, the disparities are already there for 4-year-olds. Another study says data from 2003 to 2009 indicate that by 4th grade, African American boys in public schools score about 30 points lower in reading than white boys, and the gap remains at 8th grade. So again, like, that's really important information. You really got to take that in, because that's very disheartening, honestly. So it's like, how do we address this? So again, I'm going to go into family dynamics later on in the video, but one thing for sure is that you just got to, provide more child development programs for everyone, for, black children, white children, for poor communities, that sort of thing. But honestly, like, this is tricky, because I'm in Philadelphia. There are already free programs. If people want to have like a nurse come to their house every week or two, talk about parenting, stuff like that, like, this is already there. So it's kind of a catch-22. Like, how do you get someone to participate? And you can't force people. Like, I think that that's not the right way to go about it either. So I think a solution to this idea is just leaders in the community. They just gotta step up, like, through word of mouth, through being on TV, influencers out there with influence. They just gotta prioritize childhood development. Like, reading to your child, man, that's so important. Talking to your child, like, that's free. Every parent can do that pretty much. And even my partner and I, like, you gotta really evaluate, like, the cognitive ability of your child versus money. Right? Because so many parents are like, oh, I need to make money for my child. I need to make money for my child. Look, when they're 3 years old, that doesn't matter at all. Like, you gotta find time to prioritize your child's development. Like, that's the most important thing. So my partner and I, like, we're actually, we make less money combined than the average family out there. So, like, we're actually closer to poverty than not. But you best believe H, no matter what, will be internally wealthy, no matter what, because we prioritize that. We both at times have sacrificed money and time at our jobs for our child's self-development, because we don't want him to be one of those 4-year-olds with that lowest proficiency score. So that's up to us. That's up to us totally. And it's like, this is really important to understand, because like, our child, mixed race child, will not be disadvantaged at age 4, no matter what, because we're gonna put in the work. He's not gonna be reading at a 3-year-old when he's 4. That's for certain. So like, if that is true, which I think it is for my child, then you're saying, like, is systemic racism actually related to race, or is it just related to poverty and parenting habits? So that's a conversation that needs to be had. And I believe it's a poverty one, because you're saying, like, if some black children can read amazingly at age 4, and some black children can't, and some white children can, and some white children can't, and then how does this have anything to do with race? You can argue it's about poverty, and then you can kind of tackle that. So I think you need to frame some of the conversation around systemic racism in education through the poverty lens and not the race lens, and maybe some other through the race lens and not the poverty lens. But you have to distinguish the two for sure. So the next major topic of systemic racism that people talk about is criminal justice. And one thing to keep in mind with this is a lot of people, they lead in regards to this conversation talking about how it's disproportionately black people in prison. But I would be very careful to just immediately say, well, that's systemically racist. Because of course there's majority men in prison too. So if your argument is any sign of inequity in those numbers is systemically racist, then you would also argue that it's systemically sexist against men also, which I don't think people make in that argument. So you really got to dig deep to figure out the reasons why that inequity exists. And I'll be honest, it was hard finding articles of substance in regards to criminal justice, because there's a lot of emotional pieces out there that say nothing and don't really contribute much. So that was kind of a challenge for me. And there was something where like, there is an idea that even for the same offense, black people have maybe longer sentences or go to prison more than white people or other races. But again, there was conflicting information on this while researching, and I probably gotta research more to have a more informed opinion. But for example, like there was one article that said that the differences in like arrests of black people versus white people can be attributed to past criminal history, or it says that black arrestees are also disproportionately concentrated in federal districts that have higher sentencing in general. But that same article said like once they even control for those different characteristics, there was still a little bit of a disparity. But there was another article I read that claimed that there was no difference. So again, very confusing stuff. One thing I saw in an article, it just talked about like the process to convict someone. And it talks about like, judges have the discretion to hand down sentences, correction officers can discipline people in prison, which then becomes an important factor when parole boards consider if they will release someone. So again, like this is individual racism potentially, but it's part of the system. So you can make the argument that it's systemically racist in that regard, and that contributes to inequity. That's really difficult to measure though. But I mean, in general, based off that information and how the process goes, I feel like there probably should be some more collaboration around it. And the vibe I get, like I had a job interview in a prison one time, and I think some of the vibe I get from some people that work in that sort of facility is they don't really understand psychology, mental health as much as maybe they should. So I think that should be prioritized more. And I believe there should be also more structure in terms of like what the sentencing should be. Now, of course, there should be some wiggle room depending on the case, but there should be some background like, okay, the sentence is usually this amount of years or this amount of months. And then you can even break it down like given this number of prior charges or this number of prior offenses or that sort of thing. I think you can have a better framework for a sentence, so it's not like the judges have total control over it and there's such a wide range of the sentences. And then also, of course, it's a hot contention like policing in quote-unquote black neighborhoods or the inner city compared to more affluent areas. And this is very challenging because I can see both sides of the argument, and there has to be a balance there, because of course a lot of times there's more crime in the inner city, and this cannot just totally be attributed to they put black people in weed and for drugs in prison more than white people, because violence is violence. You can't fake those numbers. So of course sometimes the homicide rate in the inner city or that sort of thing is higher than in more affluent areas. So you kind of do want police to be on patrol more, just involved a little bit more. So I think you really got to be really specific when you're talking about this stuff, because it can't be like one extreme, like just the same amount of cops in all areas. Like no, that doesn't really make sense in my opinion. And in terms of like the crime in neighborhoods and kind of like why it's higher, like that's tied to a variety of factors. So it's not like black people are inherently more violent, but like it's saying it could be tied to like just poverty in general, or people just in close proximity, or just not having male role models, not having positive influences around you, easier access to drugs or alcohol. Like you can make a case all of those things are factors. So the question is like, is it systemically racist that those factors disproportionately affect black people? Like I don't know, like that's more of a deeper issue than it's like how you define systemically racist also. And side note, I think healthier eating is really important, and I think that disproportionately affects inner cities, which disproportionately affects poor people, which disproportionately affects black people also. Like corner stores, a lot of times they don't have the most healthy of food options. And of course, your diet plays a big role in your brain development and that sort of thing also. So that's something to keep in mind. Like there's no one person or one race to quote unquote blame for this, but it's just something that I hope changes over time. So there's a lot of talk right now on positive police reform and how we can make that happen. So for this talk, in general, I would say the same thing I did on the education piece. Don't just come in as the outsider thinking that you know everything. I think you have to look at what's working now. Check out those police districts that have positive relationships with the community and try to model them. So like we just need to get a more open-minded police force in general, I believe. And as common knowledge is, like we need to focus on that serve part and not just that protect part. So have more dialogue with the community. Go door to door, have free events, really have some open dialogue around that. And for the prison system, I think the culture around it right now is like that's just a consequence. But then someone gets out, they're not really changed as a person. Then the cycle just repeats and repeats. But I'm very passionate about just empowering people going through challenges. And as part of my master's degree program, I created a 12-week positive psychology program as a project. And honestly, I hope to implement this someday down the line, either myself or someone else. I'm very passionate about this because I just think in prison, like you just gotta empower people to achieve their goals and not just try to fix them. So the 12-week program, I'm gonna go into in depth in a future video, but very briefly, it's like twice a week in the last 12 weeks of someone being in prison. They'll go to a workshop and just learn different positive psychology techniques, self-reflect on their goals, how to use their adversity as strength, meditation, all that stuff, and really just try to empower them. So that's really looking at someone as an individual, not just a criminal, but as an individual looking to improve their lives. So I think that would really help the prison system to really focus more on psychology and mental health. And it's really just getting a better system. And again, I'm not going to rattle off like all these solutions because I'm not as knowledgeable about some of the specifics to it, but psychology is the part that I'm most confident in. And the next part of this video is I want to go deeper into the inequity part. And I mentioned this before in this video, but I want to go deeper into it now because in inequity, I often see in terms of like, this is the disparity, therefore systemic racism. But look, no, you can't say that. I do believe that inequity can be a sign of systemic racism either currently or in the past. So I think a lot of times it's just in the past. So like currently, some of the systems, they're not like inherently systemically racist in how they function right now, but the past dictates the present. So keep that in mind. And with this too though, you're never going to get to a point where things are totally equal, ever. That's mathematically impossible. I mean, like some group, whatever the group is always going to be a little bit below the other group. Why? Because look, people have free will. So it's like individuals are different, period. Like if God wanted us all to be the same too, we would all be the same height, we would all be the same level of attractiveness, we would all have the same DNA, the same level of intelligence. But look, people have different mindsets. So you can't say like things need to be equal among open-minded people and closed-minded people, or the most intelligent person and the person that's not the brightest. Like no, like the levels of success in life should be different. Like for society to function, like there's got to be differing levels of success. So you got to keep that in mind. And also, like there's several factors that influence this. Health is different amongst people. Education, parenting, the aspirations people have, the goal. Some people value socializing with others and vacations maybe over a career or fulfilling their purpose in life. So there's varying levels of all of this. Cultures are different. Every individual is different, so you can't generalize groups, which I see a lot of. So like all these differences among people, like of course there will not be equity in every area of life. So you got to keep that in mind. And if you try to like get that equity, you'll get a fake equity where it's like people make the same amount of money and it's communism, but individually people are not the same, and people's mental health will kind of deteriorate from there if you try to kind of fit that in where it doesn't fit, I believe. So disadvantages are built into life pretty much. You cannot keep all the variables the same no matter how hard that you try. And also, it doesn't really make sense to just focus on inequity, because guess what? You can make things equal just by making the better group less. So that doesn't actually uplift the group, below that's going through challenges at all. So keep that in mind. And just think of a simple classroom example. If there's inequity in a classroom, the highest achieving students, just give them lower test scores. Then everything is equal, right? But nothing is better because the group that was below, they didn't improve at all. So it can be a very fuzzy conversation when you're just talking about inequity, partly because of that reason. And you also have to keep in mind too that gratitude is so important, because if you're poor in the United States, you are more privileged than pretty much every single poor person in the rest of human history prior to this time period. So have some gratitude. That's very important. And you don't want to give a leg up to a race just because of maybe past discrimination or racism towards that race. So for instance, like, I do not agree with some prioritization, even by the government, of like, oh, support black businesses, stuff like that, because everything cannot be in a vacuum with that, because then where does it stop, right? Because there's disparities in every single area of life, every group. So do you want to prioritize people who have one parent? Because of course the disparities there are definitely even greater than race, or disparities for people with health issues. Like, I have hearing loss. Are you going to prioritize my business because I have hearing loss versus someone who has great hearing? It's like, no, I don't think you should, but it's a very slippery slope. Like, which disadvantages should you try to prioritize? So you want to keep that in mind too. Another reason that I push back against saying inequity equals systemic racism is just because of a few scenarios. I mean, in the NBA, it's majority black, right? And say like in the engineering field, it's majority white or Indian or Asian, I'm not really sure, but I've seen quotas for like those sort of jobs, or the proposal to have quotas for black people. But by that same logic, why is it that field and not like the NBA? And you might be thinking, well, because the NBA, it's like the best people are hired. Well, like, it could be the other way too. Like, it's a very slippery slope there. And to frame this in terms of race to gender too, think about the healthcare field. Like, why is there more female nurses? Does that mean it's systemically sexist against men? Like, no, it's just men just apply to those jobs less than women. So like, is it cool if men are hired? Sure, but I would hope for a functioning society, men will not be hired just to fill a quota over more qualified women. So it's the same thing regardless of field, in my opinion. And also, like, to go back to the MBA versus engineering example, this is tied to aspirations and culture also. Like, people just want to do different things. And this is pretty obvious. Like, if you talk to teenagers, say, like, aspirations of a teenager play into what they end up doing 10 years later. And look, it's a stereotype somewhat for maybe a black teenager to want to be a rapper or a basketball player, but it's one of the stereotypes that is pretty much true from the averages. And look, if you know anything about the inner city, like, you know that. And that, I'm not saying that that's a negative thing, but look, if you want to rap or play basketball, you gotta have a backup plan. Like, me personally, I'm actually gonna drop some music, believe it or not, in about a month, but I'm not gonna like quit my full-time day job to become a rapper. No, it's gonna be a side hustle first, and I'm gonna have some other plans around there. So like, that's just, aspirations can be different, and that can lead to people doing different things. So like, if black children disproportionately spend more hours playing basketball, or maybe they're in their inner city where there's more playgrounds, they spend more hours doing that, they're gonna more likely make it to the NBA than a white person who spends less hours. So you can apply that same logic to some other fields as well. So it's a very deep conversation, and you don't want to generalize because there's so many different variables that contribute to how people turn out pretty much. And when you simply say that inequity equals systemic racism, you're making light of the actual issues in those fields. So for example, like, there could be underlying things that restrict white players from making it to the NBA or black people from becoming engineers or something. And you totally neglect that when you just say, oh, let's just have a quota. It's like, no, if there's actual discriminatory policies in engineering, like, fix those. Go to the root and stop being lazy and just having a quota and fixing the same thing on the surface that doesn't fix anything at all. So like, I really can't stand self-righteous people who have like, oh, I'm gonna have a quota because I'm fighting against systemic racism. No, you're just lazy and you don't want to go to the core of the issues for why there's not enough black people maybe applying to certain jobs out there, or maybe why they're not graduating from college or doing all this stuff to the extent of other races. So you really gotta go to the core of the issue. And an example with this too is, say like, a black student in school, say they were discriminated against by the teacher and they had a lesser grade than a white counterpart for pretty much the same paper. Like, you don't just raise that student's grade and then be done with it. No, you talk with the teacher and you probably fire them. So that's like an example with that. You don't just fix the outer thing, you go to the core of what is wrong and you address that. I'm gonna go into another example of why inequity is inevitable. So even in a family, say, of 5 children, right? Do they all have equal outcomes 20 years later? No. So the question is, if you're not going to have equal outcomes in a single family, how could you have equal outcomes in a whole society? It's not possible. It's not possible. Like, children in a family might turn out different because of luck or just different aspirations or work ethics or how they process information or health or peer influence or media consumption or hobbies. You know, like for me personally, like I wrote in a sports book, a journal from pretty much age 12 to 18 every day. Like that was my hobby. So you're telling me that, you know, I would graduate and have the same amount of money 30 years later as someone who just partied in high school? Like no, like things cannot be equal because you got to reward sacrifice. You got to reward hard work. Everyone does not get a cookie. And you may be asking, well, Brian, like we're not talking about that in regards to systemic racism. We're talking about things have to be equal and people have the same opportunity at the beginning stages of life. Well, guess what? That's not possible either. Why? Because parents are not created equally. They are not. That's just a fact of life. And nobody can change that unless you literally randomize babies coming out of the womb. And I hope for certain we don't get to that point. Because honestly, I've never met anyone ever who hasn't quote unquote made it if they make good decisions and they had great family support. I never met anyone like that in my entire life. And if you find that some pushback against that, I'm just gonna ask you, why are you being disempowering? Why? Like if you didn't make it, perhaps it was because you were led astray by bad family or poor decision making, or it was another reason. But why would you go to the other reason first instead of your own decision making? Right? Always go to yourself first. And this ties into with the parenting thing of that's the ultimate privilege. Like having two amazing parents, that's the ultimate privilege. That's the ultimate advantage over having one parent or two mediocre parents. And the idea is that for a child coming up and like how they're processing things, like two great parents are always better than one great parent and one mediocre parent, which is better than one great parent, which is better than two mediocre parents, which is better than one mediocre parent. So that's something to keep in mind, like the disadvantage is already built in, and that's a big factor in why there's inequity later in life, because those disparities with parenting are across race also, which I'm going to go into in a part coming up in the video. And actually, if things were equal amongst races, that would be more of a sign to me that something suspicious was going on. And I also recommend that for you to use numbers very carefully, because as someone who got an 800 on my math SAT, I can smell BS when I see it, when people misuse numbers to prove a point. So I see a lot of that in regards to the conversation on systemic racism. And I also think it's important to take note of what maybe certain races are doing that's positive. So like I mentioned earlier, the reading scores for Asian children is higher than for other races. So why is that? So I think a lot of times the Asian culture is, you know, positive in terms of parenting and instilling work ethic in their children and that sort of thing. So you can learn a lot from that. And of course there are poor Asians, but that kind of contributes to a major point, is that poverty plays a major factor in the disadvantages, and sometimes it's not skin color. Because look, I think like all the disadvantages pretty much currently either stem from past racism or culture or mindsets or poverty or other circumstances, and most doesn't have anything to do with skin color in the present. So that's not saying that systemic racism doesn't exist, but it is saying that it's mostly in the form of trickle-down disadvantages from past racism that maybe contribute to negative factors that affect people currently. So that sentence was a handful, but replay that if you need to hear it again. And to keep in mind with this too is sometimes African immigrants, I think the averages are higher than for Black Americans. So that's something to keep in mind. If racism was such a current issue, you know, instilling in people's mind from different races, they would be negatively affected too, but a lot aren't by the averages. So it's like inequity is a poor way of evaluating racism precisely for that reason, I believe. And this brings me to reparations too. I'm open to considering reparations. So there's positive and negative to it. Because past racism plays so much into current situations, it's a conversation worth having. But I think you really have to get specific with it. Who would benefit from it? I think it should just go to maybe people whose ancestors were slaves, or maybe were negatively impacted by racist policies specifically. I don't think it should go to just every black person. And I say that as a parent of a mixed race child. So honestly, my child would probably get it if you're giving it to every mixed race or black child, but that wouldn't be fair because his ancestors didn't go through struggle in terms of racism like that in the United States. And internally inside my head, there's a lot of pushback to reparations that I want to acknowledge. One is, even if it's just in regards to race, Asian Americans were discriminated against at one point too. Would they get it? And then it's like, is it just race or is it other disadvantages too across human history? So like, where does it end? And then another pushback is, I believe a key meaning to life is actually getting what you earn. So I think it's hurtful almost to your human spirit to get something that you didn't deserve. So just getting some because maybe someone in your ancestry tree experienced something, that can be hurtful. And I think like that doesn't really teach someone self-development and self-responsibility and the tools that they need to live fulfilling lives. So I'm kind of playing with that inside my head also. But I'm definitely open to the conversation about reparations at the very least. You just have to be very specific with it. And I hope like this segment on inequity really just inspires you to just think deeply about it and really go beyond the surface with it. Hey, what's up? It's Brian again. And as you can see, this is another night because my camera is not capable of filming this all in one night due to the battery. So first off, I just want to wrap up the inequity conversation in regards to systemic racism and mention a few additional points and just wrap things up a little bit. So one thing I want to mention is you do not want to double count and target a variable that's not the actual variable that you're trying to address, which I see some people do in regards to racism and systemic racism. So one example is just with the health system, particularly right now with COVID-19. I've seen people say, oh, because black people get it disproportionately, then they're more susceptible to the virus. Or I've even seen states consider giving black people the virus first, specifically because of the numbers of the people who have gotten it. But that is so misguided once you actually think things through and figure out the underlying factors for why that is. So basically, as we all know, COVID targets, like any disease, people who are more close together, right? So where are people closest together in the United States? The cities. So it's no coincidence that New York, the most populated city, has the highest rate of COVID. I'm in Philadelphia, another populated city, high rate. So black people are disproportionately in these cities because they're closer together. So it's very common sense, but it's like when you're consumed by an ideology and then you're not thinking straight. So you really gotta snap out of that, get out of your group perspective and think at things from a more logical perspective. And look, if you're pushing back against this, you sound like a racist because just hearing some people on TV, they're almost acting like being black by itself is a risk factor for COVID, as if you're more susceptible to get diseases. Like that's something that a racist would say. So I really push back against that. Like people gotta look at the underlying factors for things. Diseases obviously do not discriminate. And so pretty much like inequity is not by itself a sign of systemic racism. It can be, but you gotta look at the underlying factors. And a society where there's equity for every individual, race to race, gender to gender, sexual orientation, family history, criminal background, mindsets, health issues, that's impossible. And look, if you're trying to get that, like I said previously, you're taking the power and agency away from the individual. It's a form of slavery, I believe, because you can't get higher and you can't get lower. And I refuse to be a slave. I refuse to have my son, black children, white children be as slaves in the future. Period. I don't want them to be looked at as their group and not as their individual identity that they want. I do not want that. And look, if you're trying to get equity tied to this slavery thing, you suppress drive to get higher. Because guess what? Part of life is you don't know where you're going to end up. That's a part of life. That's partly what makes it fun, right? So like you need to have that mindset. That's a big meaning of life, I believe, is the ability to rise higher, to get to another level in life. And that goes regardless of your age too. Like when I'm 40, 50, 60, I want to have the capability to be higher, to reach higher levels of success, and also have the risk to maybe, look, I can be at the bottom. That's what keeps me going in life. That's a key factor and igniter for why life is so great. And you suppress that through saying everyone is just equal outcomes. You're taking the life out of people. And I refuse to be an advocate for that sort of thing. And that doesn't tackle the underlying issues of systemic racism when you shallowly look at it through just inequity and equity. So the next part of this video is on family dynamics. And of course, I referenced this a bit earlier in the video, and it's, I think, the number one contributor to inequity among races. And the systemic racism tied to this is specifically people just not caring about it. It is honestly ridiculous how much I've heard about systemic racism and racism this year in particular, but very rarely have people ever talked about parenting and family dynamics as topics to address to solve it. So that's very disheartening, So I'm going to reference what I said earlier. At 4 years old, the inequity is already there among races. It's already there. So anything you target after that is not targeting the root issue. So I don't want black children on the averages having to play catch up at age 4, 5, 6. So you got to address parenting. So I'm going to mention some statistics in reference to what I'm talking about. So there is some variance here. So a couple studies kind of, 1, 2, 3 percentage points were different. But in general, and I'll link all this below, in the 1960s, the single parenthood rate for black children was pretty much like 22 to 25%, white children like 3%. So that grew to about 70 to 75% for black children in 2018 and right now, and for white children about 25% to 30%. So of course it's risen among all races in the past 50 years, but black children were already at a high mark back in the 1960s, and it's really high now at 70, 75%. So that's a big issue. And in terms of like the reasons why that is, like this video isn't so much about that, but I think it could help us try to address the issue to kind of look back, like how do we get to this point? So I would recommend an economist named Thomas Sowell. He has several content about this online. He mentions like the welfare state specifically started in the 1960s, so almost incentivizing not having two parents in the home. He also talked about just failed government policies, sometimes by Democrats in the inner city. And he talked about how like sometimes in the 1960s, like black businesses were actually kind of thriving almost. And then it's kind of going backwards almost from there in some respects. So I need to research this a lot more, but just from hearing him speak, it seems like there's a lot of truth there. And look, in terms of like this whole topic too, it can be a touchy subject. And that's particularly just because people sometimes, they kind of make up your connotation for you. Like if you're coming from a place of like, oh, let's actually tackle the issues, that's different than, oh, just shaming people, right? Like that's not what I'm doing. I'm trying to solve the issue of what's going on. So like if you're talking about trying to uplift people who are, struggling, you got to look at why they are struggling. And when you look at it statistically, like if you're going to prison, like if you're not having a good job, if you're not going to college, like all these things, you most likely come from a broken home. And this is not generalizing black people or any race. It's just factually saying that when you're looking at people who are really struggling, they're disproportionately from single parent homes. And once again, I don't care like who said this previously, because it's the truth. And you gotta look at the truth to form solutions. And another thing that I want to say is just the fact that single parenthood has grown so much over the years, that's so disheartening. And honestly, the way statistics work is like this might get worse a little bit over time too. Because like when you come from a single parent home, you're more likely to be a single parent yourself. So I really hope that the inequity doesn't go backwards purely because of that. And if you're pushing back against this, like Brian, like there's all these outside factors, like why are you talking about issues within the community? Well, I'm talking about that because you need to address that first before looking at things on the outside. And when I say you, I'm talking about me. I'm talking about everyone. Like you need to ask, like, where is my responsibility in my life circumstances first? Like for me personally, like say a teacher lied to me about a test, said something was not going to be on the test, but it was. But I also didn't study for the test and I did poorly. Like which one of those two should I focus on first? What the teacher said or the fact that I didn't study? You gotta focus on the fact that I didn't study. You gotta focus on yourself first. Look in the mirror, look inward, and then go outward. And this is so important. And you can translate this honestly to any area of life. You really can. Like even in a relationship, I guarantee you your relationship is not working out if you have an outward, inward sort of perspective. Like telling your partner things like, oh, let me focus on what my partner can stop doing before I improve myself. Like, nah, it doesn't work like that. Success in life, you gotta look in yourself first, prioritize yourself first. And look, I say all this out of love too. Like, I'm not trying to shame people, but it's something that people need to hear if you want to have the highest level of self-improvement. So another example with this, like if you're one of those people that parties in high school and then you get bad grades on tests, you can't then turn around 5 years later and be like, oh, this systemic racism is holding me back because I didn't do well in high school. Like, no, like you didn't put in the work. You know, it's like, it's one thing to address the outer issue when you're taking care of yourself. Like, that's one thing, and that's probably okay. But when you're not taking care of yourself, then that's an issue, because that's saying you're prioritizing external over internal. You know, like if you're a piss poor parent, but you're talking about the disparities at age 4, 5, 6 in the education system, just stop it right now, because you're being a major hypocrite. So you basically got to prioritize your own self-determination. And the systemic racism that I'm seeing is people not caring about that. They're not recognizing Black people's ability to self-improve individually by themselves, right? So it's like, of course there's unfair treatment in some respects on the outside, but there is power in the community to change it. And a lot of times mainstream media and people don't want to recognize that. They don't want to talk about that. So you really just have to take ownership over your own self-improvement, basically. And to bring this back to the family dynamics conversation, you just have to own your parenting. You have to recognize that parenting matters. It really does. It matters in someone's success. And this is why it's so frustrating hearing the talk on inequity versus equity. Because like, as a parent myself, like I know my child Ace will have a lot of positive character traits when he grows up. So he's going to be one of those people that are successful, maybe those higher achievers. And people are going to still talk about like, oh, the inequity holding Black people back. But I'm thinking like, my son being a mixed race child, he's not going to be held back because I know I'm putting the work in right now. And I'm going to be very straight up too. Like if your child cannot read at like a, say, 5-year-old level by the time they're 5, unless they have health issues that you can't control, that's on you as a parent, period. It doesn't matter how much money you make, because to speak words out of your mouth, that's free. Libraries, at least where I am in Philadelphia, are free to access. Even if you want to buy books, they're cheap as hell online. So you really got to take responsibility for your parenting. And don't focus on money as much, you know, in terms of like what your child needs. Focus on their mindset, instilling positive mindsets in them. You know, that's why Miriam and I did a 17 video Raising an A series, because there's nothing more important to us than parenting. We recognize that humans are not machines. You know, so mindset is more important than money, the social process development for a child. So you really got to take ownership of that. You know, even diet too, like that matters for children. And you know, there's WIC food stamps, like everyone has access to the, you know, high quality foods pretty much. So a lot of times it's just effort in terms of buying the right foods and all that. You know, are you prioritizing reading to your child, or are you prioritizing watching TV and them just being on your phone, or just, you know, playing with a toy when they're not really capable of learning with that toy? You know, so you really got to think deeply about these things. There's so much, you know, tied to parenting. Check out my Raising an A series for more. But I think parenting is really the number one factor when you're really talking about how to address a lot of the disparities out there. And if you're a single parent out there too, I don't want you hearing this like, oh, Brian, like you're saying 2 parents are really valuable in the home. Well, you know, I'm a single parent. Like, you want me to feel shame about that? Like, no, I don't. I want you to feel empowered by the fact that if you're a great parent, your child will be more well off than 2 mediocre parents. You know, like your child, you gotta recognize, like you gotta put in more work though. It's more challenging as a single parent. You do recognize that, right? So if you recognize that, then I don't really think you're pushing back on what I'm saying. I'm just saying you wouldn't recommend being a single parent to another person, because it's not the ideal situation to be. So in terms of how to address the pandemic of single parenthood that affects all races and disproportionately affects Black people, it's a bit complicated and it's not so easy too. So a couple of things I want to mention is, I think daycares in general just need to have higher training. You know, a quick story with my job is a coworker had a friend that was working for a daycare, and they wanted to hire some of our participants 18 to 21 years old to work for the daycare. But just through the communication that was going on, it didn't seem like they were even interested in our participants' qualifications or anything like that. They just wanted to hire them. So the vibe I get around the childcare system, at least in some parts, is that they don't really prioritize like having the highest quality people and really prioritizing the child development of the children there. So I think we just need to have a broader conversation around the importance of child development. You know, the knowledge is out there. Like, there's information out there. We just have to share more. And I think in terms of like celebrities, media influencers, the entertainment industry, they can be the leaders for this. Because guess what? Like, the next generation, they're not going to listen to a lecture from some government official on the importance of parenting. No, they're going to listen to their favorite artist talk about the importance of parenting, or a celebrity. Like, that's where the influence is. And I'm going to go into it later in the video, but the music industry, at least a lot of it nowadays, is very negative. You know, particularly in the rap industry, they might glorify baby mamas or sleeping with 20 people, or, you know, being on child support and just all this stuff, all this discouraging talk. They're glorifying it and they're normalizing it. So we really have to fight against that as society if we're actually trying to fight systemic racism. And I think the million, billion, $1 trillion question is, how do you get people to be amazing parents? You know, I think that's tricky. And I think it's just, people just gotta be it. It's gotta be in their heart. I think you just gotta recognize that one of the biggest meanings of life, I believe, is positively impacting the world and leaving a legacy and positively impacting the legacy after you, your offspring. So I think people just have to dig deep about that, figure out the meaning of life, and just what brings them value. And I think they'll understand, like, parenting is just a major component of that. Then, you know, through a lot of self-reflection, just society in general can self-reflect to prioritize it more. Easier said than done. And of course, I did this 17 video series on parenting, so check that out if you want some more information on it. And I think a big thing is if we're not incentivizing parenting, which is very hard to do, we at least can't de-incentivize it. You know, and once you kind of look at things a little bit more critically, you realize that a lot of this has been going on, you know, with child support, with welfare system. They're kind of discouraging two parents being in the home. So like, all that stuff is obviously not working in the way that it's intended to, given the statistics that I mentioned 10 minutes ago. So we really got to look at that critically. And I have a big problem with the child support system because it insinuates that what a child needs is money. And as I just mentioned, it's all about mindset. Money is pretty much last on the totem pole. Like, children need positive role models in the home. They need all that stuff. So if the government actually cared about children, they would maybe emphasize more mentorship programs. You know, of course, there's community organizations that are out there that maybe, you know, a single mom can go to for her 12-year-old son, but they're not as accessible as they should be, especially when the child support system makes so much money and very little of that goes into actually finding some male role models for little children that need it, that maybe don't have a father in the home. So I think stuff like that we really need to address. Like, if there is single parenthood out there, and if, you know, a mom or dad, single parent, they want like their child to have a role model of the opposite sex, it should be a little bit easier to find. You know, the government has so much money. I'm sure, you know, people would be willing to line up, like, you know, like the organization Big Brothers Big Sister. I mean, they do stuff like that. But I think the government can kind of be the lead on that and really fund some organizations like that more, instead of putting so much money into the child support system. So it's pretty much like, look, if you're not talking about parenting to uplift communities, then you're literally not even having the conversation at all. Because as I said, all the disparities pretty much exist prior to children even going into school. And like, for my child right now, like, systemic racism and racism in general is not affecting him at all. He's just with us 95% of the time, and, you know, 3 or 4% with my parents and a couple other percent with some other people in his life, you know, when like we have to go out. But it's pretty much all on us. It's all on parents to address their child's mental health and their internal wealth, so that by the time they're 5, 6, 7, they're not at a disadvantage. So the next form of systemic racism I'm going to cover is mainstream media and just the voices out there. So I think they're systemic racist to the human race, actually, with their negative messaging overall right now. And this is partly due to just technology, where like sensible, logical takes right now, they don't get views. So they got to put up extreme viewpoints. They got to highlight those in order to get views. And this is systemically racist against black people in that they're told a lot of the times, you are disadvantaged. They're told this a lot, like just through the conversations that are being had. And I go much deeper into this concept in a couple of videos. The one video on this channel had stop trying to hold black people down. And then on my See Humor channel, it was how to victimize your child. So I go deeper into like victim mentality creation and stuff like that, and how the media often plays off that and hurts Black children. But it's like, in general, they confuse validation and encouragement. You know, like they might say it's okay to be scared, it's okay to feel hurt, but then a lot of times Black children are confused and they feel like that's the only way to feel, right? And some people, like I said in my previous videos, they have good intentions with this. Others have sinister intentions. You know, so you have to snap out of it and really recognize like what's going on here, right? So like raising a mixed race child, this is something that I have to actively fight against, that someone with a white child doesn't have to worry about. So that's why it's systemically racist in my opinion. You know, like for Ace right now, like there are no racists in his life. You know, so the only thing he has to worry about, and myself, is all the negative messaging on TV. Like that is gonna try to hold him back. That's what I have to work against, because nothing else is affecting him right now and won't. Like children in general, they don't really experience direct racism. They just hear all the energies around it, and that hurts their soul. So you really gotta fight against that. You know, like telling a kid that they're oppressed, that they're not privileged like white people, all this stuff, it's just so disempowering. And it leads to internalized racism a lot of the time, where little children, they feel inferior because of their skin color. So you gotta fight against that. Like that's why none of my videos I'll talk like, oh, Black people are oppressed, Black people are this, is all this stuff against them. You know, if I do say something like that, like I am a little bit in this video, I'm doing it in an empowering way, saying like, do not feel that way. Do not feel that way. You know, we have to get to a point in society where we're promoting Black people in a positive light. You know, people do that somewhat, and I'm encouraging that even more and more. Of course, while you're doing that, don't, you know, say that you're above other people either. I believe rising up all boats pretty much, especially your own. And this is just so important, and I'm gonna mention a couple things I've seen with this. So I've seen a couple clips, like when I see it, I know when someone has a victim mentality. I've seen a child be like 18, 19, 20 on TV, and they say, oh, why do you feel oppressed? And they say, well, very seriously, they say, oh, my parents taught me from an early age I have to work twice as hard as white people. And you can see it in the person's eyes. They haven't actually experienced any racism whatsoever. It was just their parents brainwashing them, that assuming they were going to experience it, but they never did. So they internalized it anyway. You know, I've seen a person on TV, they were discriminated against, I think, with like a realtor with housing. So they were talking about like, they have to tell their child when they grow up they're going to be discriminated against. You know, it's just like ingraining the trauma in the child's brain before they even experience it. Like that sort of stuff you got to actively fight against. And like white children, they don't have to worry about that stuff. Like they don't have to worry about their parents instilling inferior mentalities in their brain. Black children often do. And again, a lot of Black adults, like, I feel for you, I feel for you, I feel for you, because the mainstream media is brainwashing you, is putting this down your throats. So I'm not necessarily saying it's your fault, but I am saying it's your responsibility to overcome the negative media messaging out there. And it's like, this is just tied to positive psychology too. Like putting all of your energies to stuff you don't want, as Black people are encouraged to do, which is part of the systemic racism, that's negative. You gotta focus on what you want and then try to achieve that. Because if not, it just creates all this like negative energy, right? And it's making a lot of people right now just feel exhausted. Just feel exhausted around all this talk. You know, Black people in particular. Like there's a lot of nerves and dishonesty around race too. Especially white people just tiptoeing over their words. And anyone who tiptoes over their words, that's not positive at all, because it's just dishonesty. And if we're trying to tackle systemic racism and bring solutions to the table, we can't have an atmosphere where people are scared to say the wrong thing. So I think just the fact that that atmosphere is created is systemically racist in and of itself, because it's encouraging suppression of self-expression. You know, so I think that's really important to understand. And just this whole thing on the external, it's stopping Black youth's drive on the averages from achieving success in life. And look, I'm not even speaking from things I've read, I'm speaking from experience. I've worked with hundreds and hundreds of Black youth, 18 to 21 years old, in the middle school also. And I've seen young people who've gone through a lot of challenges, maybe experienced racism, but sometimes the staff members and the teachers and the workers that work with them, they talk about it in such a disempowering way. They want them to live in their victimhood. And that's just so backwards. And sometimes like Black children, they give into it. and then they don't feel the necessity or the responsibility to work hard to achieve something, and they latch onto the excuse that's given to them. And I've also seen black youth not latch onto the excuse and be like, look, I'm gonna use all this external adversity to my advantage, and I'm gonna work harder than the next person, and I'm gonna grind to achieve success. So there's two different ways to go about it. And a lot of times black children and black people, they're encouraged to latch onto the victimhood card, but you gotta really fight against that. So the next part of systemic racism that I want to address is the entertainment industry. So as I touched on previously in this video, there are a lot of music artists and just entertainers, celebrities that just promote negative behavior, that promote negative stereotypes, that glorify negative factors that contribute to a lot of the disparities between races. And it's just ridiculous. So I'm not gonna go as far as saying the individual person saying this stuff is racist. I don't really want to focus on that. I'm more so saying that the atmosphere around all this and just people just not caring about it is the systemic racism in society. Because you best believe, if there was like movies or a particular subset of a culture in music that's promoting negative behaviors that are, say, disproportionately affecting white children, you best believe the media will be talking about it. They would want to address it. They would go to the core issue. They would call those people out and be like, what are you doing negatively affecting white children? Stop it. Like, you're full of nonsense, right? But people do not say that to people that disproportionately affect black children in a negative way through their lyrics or just through what they say, right? So why is that? I think that's a part of systemic racism. And you can break this down on an individual level also, as I mentioned in a previous video that I did. So keep this clip in mind. A major underlooked form of racism is not advocating for solutions and improvements to issues that disproportionately affect one race, for no reasons other than that you view that race as not worthy of the effort and care necessary to yield impactful and positive solutions. So I refuse to be one of those people that turns a blind eye to the real issues that are negatively affecting black children and black people. So the music industry, as I said, it just normalizes negative behavior, right? So especially in regards to death. So we all know that black on black or just inner city crime. I'll say one thing on black crime. I think there's two different viewpoints of that. I think it could be stated that in some circles, like a racist may talk about black on black crime. But the difference is like a racist would talk about it just on that first word part, black on black. Like they're focused on the killer part. Like, let's lock up that killer, put him in prison. I'm not talking about that part. I'm talking about the second part. I'm talking about black children and black people dying on the streets every single day, especially where I live in Philadelphia, and people turn a blind eye to it. In the music industry, they promote shooting someone up. I've seen music videos still to this day, people flashing guns. That stuff is ridiculous. So it's systemically racist in that people see stuff like that and they just turn a blind eye. They don't care. I can't stand that. Even on abortion, black babies get killed way more disproportionately than other races. People just turn a blind eye. They don't care. They say, not my problem. They're just racist pretty much, and I can't stand people like that. It's like, look, I might see like a CEO person on TV say Black Lives Matter. If they're not talking about real issues like I'm talking about in this video, then just get out of here, because I can see through you. You're just being fake. Period. And I see a lot of that. People turning their cheek to real issues that's going on. The music industry, again, they promote drugs and all that stuff. Like, you can't talk about reforming the prison system, reforming the criminal justice system, living productive lives, and then in a song you're promoting drugs and stuff. And if you're singing that song and you don't see anything wrong with it, or you're not calling it out too, you're a part of the issue also. You're a part of the issue. You're probably one of those people promoting these negative and harmful behaviors, and then you're probably framing it as empowering. I stand against that sort of mentality. That's a part of the systemically racist system, in my opinion. People seeing that and not caring about it, not doing anything about it. So if you're a person, you gotta attack that too, especially if you're a black person. Because the music industry, talking about gun violence, talking about, promoting sex, framing your self-worth to your body, like all these negative things, you gotta attack that, because that's just harmful to you, your community, your children, to everyone. And I'm not saying that's black culture. I'm saying that that's a part of the music culture that is almost saying they're black culture when they're not. They're promoting the negative stereotypes that people have of black culture, and they're promoting it. It's so backwards. It's so backwards. You have to fight against that. So you really just have to understand the concept that constructive feedback is how someone grows, pretty much. So you have to call out the sectors of society that are negatively affecting black people, even if a black person is a part of that society. You have to call that out. Because look, if you're trying to improve a community, right, you gotta look at what's wrong. You gotta look at what's wrong. You gotta improve the issues that are going on. And it's like the systemically racist part, as I said many times in this video, is like if there's a major issue in the white community that's negatively affecting people, like people tackle that. People look at the issues and be like, okay, what is the white community doing wrong that can improve? Like, what is the area of improvement? Let's tackle that. Like, let's improve, right? But then with the black community, we can't talk about that. That's a right-wing talking point. That's a part of the systemically racist system that I'm talking about. People don't talk about the solutions to it, and I'm just tired of it. I mean, I've only been alive 27 years, but the inner cities, since I've been alive at the very least, they haven't changed whatsoever. Things have gotten worse. Yet politicians, they seem to be elected saying they're going to do all this stuff. They don't end up doing practically anything. So you really got to think critically about this stuff. We got to go to the core of the issue. We really do. And like, I see so many people on TV, as I said in previous videos in this series, that are so disconnected from what's going on in the inner cities and in the hood, or they're just sinister people. They're banking 200 grand a year. They're living privileged life. They're just disconnected. They don't know what's going on, or they do know what's going on, and they're just playing off black people. I'm just so sick of that. And look, as I said in my part 3 video on the racist spectrum, on an individual level, racism can be hard to decipher. Sometimes it can be someone who acts like they're being kind, but they're actually just looking at a black person as a child or as a pet to be cared for. And they look at them like, oh, they can't improve themselves on their own. So they're not even going to try to let them know what their own issues are. Right? I can't stand that mentality. I look at people as I look at myself. I look at my issues that I'm going through and I tackle that first. I always look in the mirror first. I take responsibility for my own actions before anyone else's, because I know, based off my experience, that's how you manifest the highest form of self-development that you possibly can manifest. So you need to look inward and don't look outward, right? Don't give in to the temptation to rely on the government to fix systemic racism or give your agency and power to some external factor, right? Particularly when there's racists out there and messaging out there that's trying to convince you that you don't have the control within yourself to achieve greatness in life. You do, because though there is systemic racism externally, there's also a good portion of that is just media messaging telling you that you're inferior, so you gotta fight that off. And you also gotta recognize that even if things are 100% fair out there, it's still up to you to make something of yourself, to live a positive life. So you gotta take that to heart. So to wrap up, I just wanna encourage you to really dig deeper on your own on the subject of systemic racism. Like I talked about a lot of things in this video, and I want you to reflect on all this stuff and even do your own research too. Like, don't just believe me. Do your own research on these things and have your own viewpoint. Don't let someone else take control of your thoughts, including myself. Because there's a lot of deep topics. Wealth gap, education system, criminal justice, parenting, mindsets, messaging, entertainment. I had a whole section on how to frame the inequity discussion too. So a lot of deep subjects that you really gotta research and be in tune with. And look, if you're just waking up to racism and race-related issues this year, you gotta be conscious, like I said, of all the sinister and illogical perspectives out there. You really do. I mean, for myself, like, I've been invested in race-related issues for years now. I've been passionate about just empowering people since college. So I haven't just woken up to it. I put in a lot of work mentally to get to the point that I'm at. And I've recognized over the years that you have to be open to and respect diversity of opinion. You really do, because not everyone sees things the same way, and that's okay. That's how you learn from other people. And even with me, like if you disagree with me on something in this video, I respect that totally. You know, kindly and respectfully, man, point out in the comment section something you don't see eye to eye with me with. And maybe we can have a productive dialogue on it. Because look, as long as we all have the same goals, right? To empower Black people, to uplift communities, to uplift everybody, to end racism, systemic racism, then we're on the same team. You know, we can disagree, maybe not see eye to eye, and then maybe, you know, change each other's perspective for good. You know, like I'm very open to changing my perspective on something. And that's just one thing I want you to take to heart in this video. Like, open your mind. Open your mind to the complexities of the conversation of systemic racism. You know, and really just take ownership of it. Like, you need to understand that to attack it, you gotta really dig deep to the underlying core issues. And don't just be lazy and be like, oh, there's an inequity, thus systemic racism, so let's have these conversations. Then you never had those conversations. Don't do that. And dig deeper, and hopefully we as society can address systemic racism in the United States. Overcome racism. Share the messages, share the videos.